fraud. It's not fraud.
It's not. I need to rephrase that then.
I think you can say, I think my religion is the best, but ours is the best. And I feel that. I think we should fight back. No one should be treated the way we were in the Book of Mormon musical. The Book of Mormon may be the most significant work of literature created in Western civilization.
Hey guys, we are back in New York City again. I'm Luke Hanson, editor-in-chief of Ward Radio News, and we know you guys liked the last Bushman interview, and so we're like, hey, let's come back. We still got some more stuff we want to talk to him about, so we're here. We're heading over his place right now, and hopefully it's a great interview. See you there. You know, Cardin did a pretty good job, but let me show you how it's done. Richard Bushman, pleasure to interview you. I guess I haven't interviewed you before, but Ward Radio has interviewed you before. So thank you for that interview and also doing this other one. I wanted to start kind of where our previous interview was talking about, specifically with the New Atheists, which was a group of people, specifically Dawkins, Harris, Hitchens. I forget what the fourth guy was, because it was like the four horsemen of the apocalypse. And it came about in the early 2000s and was basically a militant expression of saying, no, there's no God. And essentially we need to demand or prove to other people it's very important for human flourishing to prove that God doesn't exist. You probably, at least if you didn't take part in those discussions, you probably were around them, being in the academic sphere, right? How did that interplay, how did that change what the academic conversation was like surrounding religion?
It wasn't, really didn't enter into my intellectual life very seriously. You know, by that time I'm over 70 years old. I'm pretty well fixed in my faith. So I was more an observer. We had one of them right on our Columbia philosophy faculty, and I heard him talk. And so I formed an attitude which was just a little bit scornful. You know, there are these powerhouse thinkers, really all very smart guys, and they have all these arguments they worked out. They sort of put religion to the grinder in this way and that. But especially one encounter we had here, the fellow talked, and there were others in the audience who were a little bit uneasy with this atheist position. And the heart of it was, it's a shallow point of view. You know, you never feel like they're dealing with the deep human problems that great philosophers and great artists have dealt with. It was more sort of a rat-a-tat-tat of machine gun fire trying to knock down as many arguments, rather than talking about human suffering and meaning. And what do you tell a widow who's lost her only son in battle? You talk to one that can't be a god. You know, it's just an inadequate language for lots of human situations.
Yeah. Why do you think it came about? And what was, especially academics, because like you said, this did kind of come from a very knowledgeable, intelligent academic perspective, these people that were at the forefront of this new philosophy and movement. What was it like before that? And what do you think led into this new atheism movement?
I don't really think they were the forefront. I think they were four horsemen who sort of got on their horses and galloped about.
So they more the poster boys?
It wasn't deeply embedded in significant human philosophical movements at that time. It was a little bit of a circus, I felt. I think it may have been a reaction to evangelical politics, that believers in God were sort of taking a significant part in electing officials. And so they wanted to sort of put them in their place. But frankly, I don't know where they came from.
Interesting. So what would you say kind of the academic position towards religion was earlier in your career, and did it evolve towards the later part of your career?
Well, I'm not sure there's an academic position. But in my day, logical positivism sort of developed out of Bertrand Russell's view of the world, which was that anything that isn't based upon sensory experience and logic, if it's not sensory, it's nonsense. And as it has no meaning, you have no way of sort of saying what are the implications of a belief unless it grows out of sensory experience. And that was a very developed, important, and I sort of got the watered down undergraduate version of this, and that's what sort of plunged me into my agnosticism. I didn't know what I would say to explain why I believed in God, because I didn't have any sensical basis for it.
Yeah. And this actually brings me to something else I've been curious about, because in a number of places you've talked about this, I don't know, faith crisis seems to be a more recent term that's come up, but essentially your struggle with the existence of God. Do you think that what pulled you out of that was a change in the information that you had? Like, was it that you found the good arguments, or was it that you questioned the presuppositions that you were coming into? For example, did you question maybe logical positivism is not the right epistemology to try and figure out these questions with?
It wasn't new information. It wasn't new arguments. I think it was more a new perspective on the world. What happens when you go on a mission is you not only are teaching the gospel, but especially in the old days, we'd teach them 8 or 10 or 15 lessons. We just kept going back every week. That you began to sense real human life. It had a great effect on my view of Marxism, for example, which was actually a stronger influence than logical positivism in my day. And the Marxists would speak of the masses, and they sort of served a certain role in history. But I went out and met real people, and there were no masses. They were just individuals struggling along, trying to make sense of their lives. And when you begin to feel life that way, then religion is very useful to anchor people, to give them confidence and give them hope.
I can almost hear somebody like a Richard Dawkins saying in reply to that, well, that might be very well for you people, but I, for one, can't just force myself to believe something that's nonsense, even if you think it improves your life. And you've probably heard something along those lines before.
That's true. I mean, he had no basis in his life, so he's not going to be a believer because he thought that way. But I just feel like that's why I say there's a shallowness to it, not intellectual depth, but really a sense of what human life is about and what's necessary to live a powerful and rewarding human life.
So if you were to be, obviously I'm playing like devil's advocate here, if you were to be really pressed on the question and say, okay, so should we only believe things based off of outcomes? What if we want actual proof, or more what you might call scientific proof that something is true?
You're saying, when you say actual proof, you're right in saying scientific proof, which means material proof. That is, you have to have some material basis. But materialism is just one view of the world. It's sort of a limited view of the world. And if you say, I'm only going to believe things that can be proven by science, you're cutting yourself off from a great deal of human life. What about all sorts of aesthetic experiences and all sorts of things that happen into our... What about love? What about love? So I think the fundamental error of the atheists and the logical positivists is think the only things you can rely on are things that can be proven by science. It's true you can't prove God by science. You can't prove there's no God by science. I mean, these guys made an attempt, but they didn't prove there's no God. They just gave lots of reasons, all the evil in the world and all this and that. That seemed ridiculous to them. But that doesn't disprove that there isn't a God who loves his children and so on. So I think it's much more sensible to be pragmatic. Does it work? See, William James struggled. He was an atheist who struggled to find God. But he was one who said we need to see God as someone we join forces with to try to make the world a better place. And I think that's the way I look at the world.
And that actually fits in pretty well with the Latter-day Saint perspective because, yeah, I mean, other Christians obviously do have this conception of kind of working with God to bring to pass, but the fact that we have an embodied God who's not in a trinity, but rather a social trinity, I think is what Blake Hostner calls it, kind of gives us more of that sense of participating in something.
Right. And our God is material. I mean, he exists he's in time, he's in a place somewhere. So
he has our same attributes, but they're just perfected. And so that gives us a path forward that you can kind of mark out and follow along to achieve that same thing that he has. Yeah. One more devil's advocate question, if I may. So somebody might come back and say, okay, so we're going to take a pragmatic approach that encapsulates all the experience of human life. Does this come with the problem of relativism? There's no absolute truth, because maybe one person would say, oh yes, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is for me. That's where I see the best outcome for my life possible. But another person says, no, the church is absolutely terrible for me, and I see that being a great detriment to my life. How then can you make an argument about, because they can't both be right, the church can't both be true, and not true. God can't. Maybe an atheist says the atheism is better for my life. Well, God can't both exist and not exist. So what would you say to kind of somebody pushing back with that pragmatic approach of saying, well, people might come to different conclusions then? Well,
this is a huge problem for all religions. I mean, the Buddhists have they're not a god, but they have a religion, and everyone else has something different. Science is unique. I'm going by Richard Rorty. I don't know if you know it.
I'm not familiar, actually, no.
But I'm a modern Mormon philosopher, a modern American philosopher, married a Mormon, even though he was devoutly atheist. But science has worked out a way to get agreement among all the differing points of view. But philosophy hasn't. Literature hasn't. There are just innumerable points of view. And the fact is you have to find a religion that suits you. Now, does that mean that everything is relative? Well, if this is your religion, this is my religion. I don't think so. I think you can say, I think my religion is the best. And then you have to make an argument. You have to say, this is why. But you're not forbidden from making an argument for why I think Mormonism works better than anything else I know. That it is true in that deep sense. But that doesn't mean I'm going to discount everything you Catholics believe. everyone is sort of trying to find what works for them. And Catholicism works for millions and millions of people. And you can't say God disapproves of that just because we have a prophet and they have a pope. God is working through the Catholic Church as well as he is through us. But we can still say, but ours is the best. And I feel that. I could be disproven sometime, but I still feel it's the best.
I think that our religion is uniquely positioned to make that sort of claim, because especially with the doctrine of the three kingdoms, even though it might kind of be more of a spectrum than three distinct boxes that you put people in, and the preaching the gospel and the life after this, we don't have to take such a hardline stance that some religions do of like, no, you have to believe A, B, and C, or else you're going to hell. There's more of what Joseph Smith said of Mormonism is truth, or President Hinckley saying, take everything good and just let us see if we can add something to it.
See, I think our problem is not to prove that we are true and everyone else is false. As we've been saying, that doesn't work. What I think we need to discover is what is our unique contribution? What is our mission among all the peoples of the world to bring about? And at this point, you have to go to temple work or something about sealing and establishing families, that we have a calling to do that, which we're trying to do. We're trying to collect every last person who ever lived on the earth and seal them together. So right now we live very amicably with all sorts of other religions. We collaborate with Catholics on all sorts of things. We don't think of them as the great and abominable church, but one of God's instruments for doing good on the earth. I think that's a very comfortable and true position to be in. But it doesn't mean we have to say, well, we have a prophet, you have a pope. Doesn't matter. We have something we have to do, and we have a prophet to guide us to do that.
Would you say that right now in our history we are the best at this ecumenical approach? Because it seems like, reading Jesus the Christ, James E. Talmage kind of seemed to have a chip on the shoulder for the Catholics. Obviously, the martyrdom caused some problems with relationships. Do you think we're kind of at the high point right now in terms of relationships with other religions?
I think it was the beginning point right now.
Okay.
I mean, we have a long history of repudiating every faith but our own. We just dismiss them. But we don't do that anymore. We are very interfaith oriented at every level, the president of the church, right down into our wards and stakes. And I think we have to be that position. We can't say we're 0.2%, not 1%, but 0.2% of the world's population. And nobody else matters. Nobody else has God. You can't say that. God's interested in all those people. So we have to learn to get along with them. Our destiny is to work with all people of goodwill to bring in the kingdom of God on earth. And we have to be willing to do that. I think, personally, the interfaith dialogue is the direction we're heading and should head in order to form alliances with all people of goodwill.
Now, in other places, you've said that you think our history wasn't the best a couple decades ago, and now the history is in a very good place. We're very good at telling our own story, right? It seems like what you think, and I'll let you comment on that if you want to, it seems like what you think now is that the next frontier that we have to tackle is participating in the arts and culture, right? And I forget the name of the foundation, but you're part of a
Center for Latter-day Saint Arts.
Mm-hmm. Center for Latter-day Saint Arts. So you can comment on the history stuff, and then I also just want to hear about kind of your work on this new frontier of more of the cultural side rather than the proofs of Mormonism or the historical side.
Well, we had idealized our history because we loved Joseph Smith. He was essential to our faith. We thought it made a huge contribution to religious knowledge. And so we idealized him. I mean, the same thing happens to George Washington or Abraham Lincoln or anyone.
Well, just a quick story on that. Apologize, but my wife and I went to Monticello recently because we moved to Virginia about a year ago. And, she had heard of Thomas Jefferson. He's the guy who wrote the Declaration. Then we go there and hear about some of the relationship with slaves and everything. She actually came away from Monticello saying, I think I like Jefferson a little less now than I did when we showed up here.
And the same thing happened at Monticello that's happened in the church. There was a whole generation of guides who, when they were told, we've got to admit he was a slaveholder and pretty cruel to his slaves, they all quit. They couldn't bear to hear that truth. But fact is, unless you're basing your history in facts, you're always insecure. You'll always turn over a rock somewhere that'll throw you for a loop. So it took us a while to sort of work our way through the idealized Joseph Smith down to someone whom we can conceive and who is there in the records. And I think now the church has committed to that. The Joseph Smith papers certainly are. And we're in a much more secure position. We're willing to go with the facts.
And you've said this in other places, but just, I guess, maybe to assure the audience, you are still of the opinion that Joseph Smith was deeply committed to following God, that he was inspired by God, and that he at least made a valiant effort to be a disciple of Jesus Christ, right?
He went through an awful lot for that church. A very hard life he led. But you just begin with the Book of Mormon and all the religious language, all the honoring of Christ, all the preaching, 500 plus pages, on and on and on. That has to come from a mind that really believes in God or is inspired by God to say those things. And then through the rest of his life.
So, great man, but not perfect man is kind of essentially where it lands.
That's right. At least as we, in our sort of genteel way, think of what a perfect hero is like. He was a little bit crude, raw. But so was Abraham Lincoln. So that's just the way it was.
Well, even George Washington, we think of him as like the pinnacle of genteel and honest and all that stuff. He even had moments of like throwing down his hat and screaming at the troops as they're retreating away.
Yeah.
So yeah, they all have their moments. So we maybe idealize Joseph Smith a little more. You think we're in a lot better place now. And now you seem to be focusing a little more on the arts part of it. How do Latter-day Saints participate in the culture? So wanted to hear some of your thoughts about how we should be participating in the culture and what we have to offer that might be unique from other faith traditions or cultures.
Well, I think we have to realize that we are a religion. We are a church, an organization. But the way the church developed by its beginning with gathering, we also became a people. We're like an ethnic group. And peoples have a culture that sort of springs out of the values and the outlook people of the culture of the people. So I think that's just a fact of our life. We have artists who try to express it. So there's that expressive side of it. Artists trying to say who I am. There's also the adornment side. Someone asked me once, when was the first Latter-day Saint work of art? And my thought was, well, you have to at least begin with a Nauvoo temple, because those ceremonies could have been performed in a barn, but they devoted themselves to making a beautiful structure far beyond their capacities in terms of their wealth and so on, in which God can be worshipped through the temple. So, and that's true from the temple beginning in Solomon's day and so on. And so beautification is deeply ingrained in our religion. But then art springs up almost spontaneously because there's people who try to find a way to express it. So I think that's what we're doing. And the way I got started was I was unhappy with the way we were being read as a people. You think of the Book of Mormon musical and what it stands for. Naive, sweet, silly, gullible people. Shallow. Kindly, but shallow. And that toured all over the country, all over the world, was one of the most popular musicals ever to appear. Hundreds of thousands of people got a laugh out of Mormonism. I don't
and
like
somebody
that.
made $1 billion.
Somebody made a lot of money on it. I don't like that. I think the church was very mature in the way they responded to it. But I'm not sure that we should do that again. I don't think we should sit by while people slap us around and then make fun. So just a joke.
So if you're in charge and the Book of Mormon, part 2 comes out, what do you propose?
I think we should fight back. We should show the prejudice that's in there. That's very nasty talk. The way Mormons are described there, not the way mentioned the way they describe Africans. And I think we should just call them out on that. No one should be treated the way we were in the Book of Mormon musical. So I think we need to do that. But that's kind of the hard grunt work. I think we also need to be expressive. We need to show we do have some depth. And we do that with our philosophy, our history, and our art. And that we think we're digging deeply into the meaning of our lives. So, so I think art has a significant place.
What you're saying kind of reminds me of the book Up From Slavery by Booker T. Washington, where he was born in slavery. I think it ended when he was about 3, so obviously it was more towards the beginning of his life, but there's a lot of challenges that you have to overcome and a lot of prejudice that was still in America for his whole life after that. And kind of the way he approached it was, well, let's build things. I'm going to build a school. I'm going to educate. We're going to teach ourselves how to make bricks. We're going to be economically independent, and we're going to prove to our community and the nation as a whole that we need to be taken seriously. And obviously, I'm not saying that Black people needed to do that in order to get their rights. They should have had those to begin with. But since we live in a fallen world, sometimes you gotta, I guess, take it on the chin and do what you need to do to be taken seriously, rather asking over and over again for common human decency.
Right. No, I think that's right. But, I mean, that's one side of it. The other side of it is artists are a great resource. There's something called the National Endowment for the Arts that sponsors artwork around the country. And that goes on the assumption that artists are a resource. They're like skilled doctors or lawyers or scholars. They help you understand yourself in the world. And it's not a trivial function. It's not just embellishment. It's penetration and perception. So I think we need to foster those artists. I began by thinking the purpose of art is to sort of show the world who we are. But I began to think,
impress them is what you're like, impress other
impressing people.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. But I see more now we need the artists to fulfill, enrich our lives. So right now we do everything we can to recognize artists, to bring them to the fore, to encourage them, to treat them with deep respect, honor them for what they do.
And do you think this effort that you think we should be making, do you think it should, like, if it would be beneficial for the church, quote unquote, Salt Lake City, to do more patronage and push it? Or do you see this as a grassroots efforts that members should do? Is there an interplay between the two? How would you like to see this go forward?
Well, the church, historically, the church, not our church only, has been a great patron of the arts.
Mm-hmm.
Because every church through all of history has wanted to be adored. I think Solomon's temple. So we should patronize, and we must be sure to use our own artists. The church lots of times goes outside of the church to get its artists. We should do with our own people, and we should treat them fairly. We should honor them. We should pay them well for their art. It's their profession. So the church is always a patron. But the church has sort of its own sharply defined mission, and the art has to sustain that mission. Art as expression of anguish, of struggle, which is also part of our religion, doesn't necessarily find its way into the foyers of our churches or the walls of the temple. So that kind of art, which may be performed by people at the margins of the church who are struggling away, also needs to be presented. So we try to reach very broadly. The Center for Latter-day Saint Arts, defines Mormon art as anything that is created by people who identify as Mormons. Maybe they may never go to church, but they say, I was born Mormon, and I honor my own heritage. We think those people should be given a voice.
It's always seemed to me a great puzzlement and also tragedy that there isn't any Hollywood-level movie about the Book of Mormon. I mean, this story that you have there in terms of the epicness of it, as well as the Native Americans, Rome is always showing up in movies and stuff, but your Mesoamericans, Heartlanders, depending on what model you're operating under, seems to be an untouched topic. And just the themes and the story of the Book of Mormon, you don't have to believe it, but it just seems like there are good stories there that Hollywood hasn't really tapped into yet. It seems like an opportunity. I don't know if you've spent any time thinking about that, but...
Well, it is an opportunity. The same is true for the life of Joseph Smith. But there have been successful plays done by producers and movies by producers about the Bible. But that happens because the depths of the Bible have been plumbed. I mean, the complexity, the struggle, the deep human issues there have been opened up by thousands of years of Jewish scholarship and Christian scholarship. Until you have scholars and philosophers and analysts who sort of open up the Book of Mormon so it's not just a series of intriguing adventure stories, then you can't get the art to go with it. So it all has to go along together. So that's why we have to sponsor our scholars as well as our artists to build this whole culture that has some depth to it.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's very cool. I resonate with that because this has been a big topic on my mind. We've actually done 2 Word Radio episodes kind of along these lines. I wanted to talk about, because you mentioned Joseph Smith, and his life seems like it could make a great biopic, or I guess you could even do a historical fiction, and people have around him. Joseph Smith is obviously a figure that people have for good and evil around the world, as Moroni said. And he is a big religious figure, but he was also operating in American society. And you became a Joseph Smith historian later in life, but you spent a lot of time working with early American history earlier in life. So I'm curious, how do you see Joseph Smith in terms of an American as part of the American story, rather than just as a religious figure?
Well, he certainly is one of our most eminent scholars now. A man named Jared Hickman teaches at Johns Hopkins. Very deep-thinking, well-respected scholar, thinks that the Book of Mormon may be the most significant work of literature created in Western civilization in the last 500 years. A little bit extravagant. But the reason he makes that case is because the great impetus behind modern history is the encounter of an old European civilization with another world that was never dreamed of. And how does Europe encounter and comprehend America? People that never heard of. It disrupts the biblical narrative. It disrupts lots of things. It creates race as an issue in society. And he thinks the Book of Mormon, with its racism and its sort of its universalism and many other things, is trying to grapple with the implications of that encounter. It's an attempt to assimilate the biblical story into an American story in many, many ways. So I think that's one way in which if Jared will write his book and get this going, we'll begin to see what the possibilities of the Book of Mormon are. I actually forget your question. What was it? I was carried away by my own.
You were doing a very good job on that. Basically, Joseph Smith as an American figure and his role in American history.
Yeah.
And then obviously the Book of Mormon is inextricably linked with that.
And in that line of reasoning, Joseph Smith, what we would say, opens a new dispensation in America. That is, he just doesn't carry down the old religion they inherited from Europe and revises it and reforms it like most Protestants did. Started anew, a fresh revelation, a new set of scriptures, a new outlook on the world. So he's really taking a stand for America. He's not patriotic in the sense of promoting the American nation as the greatest on earth, because he's a deep critic of America and the errors that the inhabitants have made and the evil has been here and how precarious our civilizations are. They get ripped up and destroyed. I mean, the Book of Mormon is a very deeply pessimistic book because, two civilizations chew themselves up. So he's a heavy critic, but he also finds a place for America in world history.
Do you think he's more of the embodiment of what America was supposed to be, or is he more of a response against some of the things that America was founded on, especially something along the lines of capitalism?
Well, I think it's, the both. I mean, it's the potential of the land to be another land of promise, a place of safety, a free place with no kings and so on, but also a vulnerable land that's perilous because evil can bring it down. So it's a critique, and it's what's called a Jeremiah. That is, it's a warning, like Jeremiah offered to Israel. If you don't repent, you will be destroyed. That's the spirit. The Jeremiah form, I don't know if you know anything about this, but it's a very strong theme in American history, and the promise and the potential disaster. And he speaks very much in those terms.
So would this thing you're talking about kind of be the John Adams, like, what have you given us, a republic if you can keep it? Is it that kind of sentiment?
That's right. The whole notion of republic for the founders is difficult, is that they're perilous. And all that is being revived. We don't know how we're going to survive. As a republic, our very foundations are being shaken right now. So yeah, it's very much in that vein.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's cool. And you've talked about Joseph Smith a lot. I mean, you wrote Rough Stone Rolling, which many people, interestingly, people both that left the church and that stayed in the church kind of look to it as a pinnacle of work on Joseph Smith. And usually people point to the fact that you attach his flaws to him and don't try and just cast them as all flaws in a con man or all purely almost perfect prophet, except for that one time he yelled at somebody. You know, usually that's kind of the way that the history has gone. But what you've also done in the book that I don't think people talk about is you attach Joseph Smith to the Book of Mormon. And you actually spent a long time commentating on the Book of Mormon, what it means as a book and what themes it has and how that played into Joseph Smith's life and the future teachings of the church. And I think that's a part that a lot of people miss from the book. And it seems to be something that you were particularly fascinated with because now you've come out with this new book called the Gold Plates, or Joseph Smith's Gold Plates, which definitely is more of a fun look. I think, what did you call it? Whimsical? Or that was what motivated you, was just to do it, just because it was interesting, looking at the gold plates. And I was interested in the gold plates. You talked about it a lot artistically being represented, and we've talked about art being represented. And I think in another interview, you said that we don't talk about them enough, or like we've stopped talking about them. I don't remember quite what the sentiment you were trying to express. Do you think the gold plates have a role to play in our mythos? And I don't mean by that a false narrative, but meaning the foundational stories of our religion, and how would you like to see them incorporated more going forward?
Well, I don't see them as the forefront of our message to the world. I think they are definitely a part of our message to the world, as part of a larger theme. Religion can be presented as an affair of the heart and mind. It's basically psychological. You try to find peace. You try to find forgiveness. You try to get a testimony, the Spirit of the Lord speaking to you. You try to believe certain things, all of it going on in your mind. But Christianity as a whole, and certainly Mormonism, is also historical. It's about things that happened in the real world. Christ died, was buried, was resurrected. God came to earth. The children of Israel were liberated from Egypt. And our religion is about God appearing to a young man, about angels appearing, about the bestowal of keys and powers. It's about things that happened in the real world. And the gold plates are probably the anchor of that view. Physical objects he holds, carries it around with him for a long time. People feel it inside them. A few people get to actually see it. So it's if you believe the gold plates, you have to believe that there's intervention, not just in our hearts and our feelings about the world, but what actually happens, what we all can agree actually occurred. And I think we don't want to forget that. So when we're teaching the gospel, it's a matter of telling the stories of actual historical events. Can't be just pray hard and you will know and that all is well and Christ will comfort you. But it's got to be, I believe certain things happen.
And you mentioned in your book that people, like you were just talking about, sometimes have a hard time dealing with what exactly the alternate story of the plates are. I think you said Dan Vogel has done the most to try and flesh out what might have happened. Fawn Brody, I think you said, sort of just skipped over it and focused on the psychological motivations for why Joseph Smith might have come up with this. What do you see if for some reason Joseph Smith wasn't a prophet, like that just is off the table, we can't have that be an option? What do you see as the second most plausible? It seems like he could have either been a con man, a demonically influenced in some way, supernaturally demonically influenced rather than divinely influenced. And then the third one is pious fraud. He had good intentions, but he still was perpetuating some sort of falsehood. Which one do you think is the most plausible one that critics make?
I think the most plausible and the most recent is Antaves. Do you know the name Antaves?
It was in the book.
This is a
right?
non-Mormon scholar who's always been interested in Mormon studies, got the Mormon studies program going at Claremont, and has written about Joseph Smith and the gold plates. And she depicts him as an innocent, carried away by his own visions. She is willing to say people do have visions. I mean, all through history, people have had visions. It's an experience that's rife in religious history. She doesn't think it's actually God giving them visions, but we just have to accept the fact people say they saw visions. We can't say, well, it wasn't really a vision.
Yeah.
They think it's a vision. We have to treat it that way, or we're not honoring their experience. And this was a visionary in the history of religion who carried him away to the point where he actually saw there were plates. And I finish up the argument, if you don't remember it from the book, is she thinks it's like the Eucharist. Is the Eucharist really bread, or is it really the body of Christ? Well, in a way it's really bread, but in another way it's really the body of Christ. And she thinks Joseph Smith felt it. The plates were real in the sense, no matter what the physical object might have been that he made or fell into his hands. He felt they were plates.
If I remember correctly, she seems to believe that maybe he made, like Dan Vogel said, some sort of tin replica of the plates, but like the Eucharist, he then completely believed that they had some sort of a transfiguration into...
Right. Vogel makes a big deal if he made plates. Vogel has to do it because he knows the sources, and the sources are filled with people holding the plates, carrying them around, putting them here, burying them there. So he has to say something. And she's willing to go along with it, but that's not her big thing. The big thing is, how does something that's commonplace become something that's surreal, something that's
So she kind of looks to other religions and says, well, they have an authentic religious belief.
Right.
This.
It's an authentic religious belief. I think that's the best alternate theory right now.
So I guess it's kind of be like a Frankenstein's monster of, it's like pious fraud, but he's also part of...
fraud. It's not fraud.
It's not... I need to rephrase that then. Because what I'm trying to convey is Joseph Smith also thought it was true, even though ultimately it wasn't divinely inspired. So like Joseph Smith was one of the defrauded people by these visions that he's having. Right. And I guess she probably also says that like Cowdery and stuff also had these visions and believed them along with Joseph. I guess would be her contention too.
I don't think she says anything about that.
Oh, interesting.
I think the witnesses are a little bit of a problem. It's very hard to deal with those witnesses if you have a secular point of view, because they said they saw something. And you say, oh, poo-poo, it couldn't be, you're just making it up. But that isn't what they said.
What's kind of shocking to me about Fawn Brody, who is, I don't know if you'd call her the original, but she was definitely the most widely praised at the time for coming up with this alternate theory of Joseph Smith. She just kind of asserted that, well, Joseph Smith had this amazing ability to induce hallucinations in other people almost at will, except he didn't know that he had this, or like he hadn't practiced this ability. It just sort of was this I was like, wow, that requires a lot of faith, doesn't it?
I mean, that's the trouble. It's just sort of so easy, sort of, if you are writing to an audience you think is not going to believe, and just find some little trick by which all this belief is instilled.
Yeah. Like, well, at least I'm not an idiot. At least that you have to have faith either way. That you try and cut how you're going to talk about this story.
In this case, though, there is some material evidence. I'm very impressed with this letter that Oliver Cowdery wrote in November of 1829, just 4 months after the witnesses saw the plates, to a guy named Blatchley, who inquired about them, saying, "No, we saw them. It was broad daylight. You know, this isn't after the church is established and he's trying to protect Joseph Smith. You know, it's in the early stages, and there it is in his own handwriting that he saw the plates." So
it's like, what do you do with that?
Yeah, I think the real problem is if this were to say Joseph Smith geode or some interesting rock formation, and you had all this evidence, you'd say, well, he must have really found it. But if you have to use those witnesses to say there were plates, there were angels, there was God, a huge set of assumptions are resting on that plate, and it's just too much to accept it all. You need more than that to support that huge load.
Mm-hmm. And I guess part of the fun is that life gets a little better when it's a little magical, rather than purely new atheist. Everything needs to be proved by. I think life gets better when it's a little bit magical, rather than this purely evidentiary, we need to prove everything with the scientific method, and just leave some room for there to be things out there that you can't explain.
Well, I feel like that. It's just that I was trying to argue there is some.
Yes.
And then you come back and say, well, it doesn't matter. I was getting confused about it.
But they came from a divine source, that non-explained, non-scientifically proven.
I think that's absolutely right. You got to leave some room for mystery.
Yeah.
And enchantment.
Well, Richard, pleasure to come back to talk with you again. Love the conversation that we have, and who knows, maybe we'll do it again sometime. But if not, this has been great. Thank you very much.
I've enjoyed it very much. Very potent questions.
Thank you.